Hello, this is Justin O'Croher of Scadwork, and I'm here to talk about orchestrating the action in your project and planning and coordinating what needs to be done. It's one of our Breakthrough Project Barriers Strategies for Success series, and we deliver these events roughly once a month for an hour each time. And you can come in at any stage in the series and then wait until it comes back to the place where you joined in, or you can view them all at once on YouTube as they're produced. So the section we're talking about now is orchestrating the action, and the project facilitator's role evolves because at the start, the facilitator is going to be planning and so on. But once we're getting to the action time of things, then they're moving more into a role of encouraging the team. And the product owner, if we're talking in agile terms, the product owner focuses on the project deliverables and the business environment. So communication is the biggest activity of leadership. We have to use the communication to get money, resources, people, budget, and so on. We need to delegate, we need to explain, we need to solve problems and resolve conflicts and so on. So communication is really a very important activity for leaders. So we're going to be talking about project leadership skills, but also management. Management, if you like, is more the tech side of business, and leadership is more the people side, but we need both of them. And then we're also going to talk about how we motivate people, or some ideas about motivation of people in the matrix organization. So the world is changing. We all know that. It's full of all sorts of issues at once: governance, complexity, conflict, collaboration, and so on. All of these things are happening at once. And it's so challenging because the best way to do it depends on so many things, such as the external, physical, or political environment, the management approach, the technology. And of course, all of these things can change at once. They can be moving along, and you could live in a country where they have elections, and all of a sudden there's a different type of government. Or maybe your company decides to get much more involved in artificial intelligence, and the working environment changes and so on. And so none of these things are stable. That's the big message here. So here's a very easy thing that you can do right at the beginning of a project, is to ask yourself just these 4 questions and see, are they under control? And if they are, that's fantastic. And if they're not, you've found out something that you need to work on. So the goals, the first thing about goals is, what are the goals of your project? Are they clear? Do people understand them? Are they easy to communicate? What people do quite often is they have presentations and slides and arrows and connections and all sorts of things. And then you stand back and you say, hey, I can't really see what's happening. So goals need to be clear. A role is, if you like, a sort of responsibility area. You could be, let's take a non-project example, you could be the waiter in a restaurant, and then your role is to collect the orders from the visitors and then convey that to the kitchen. And then when it comes back, bring it onto the table. That's the role. And so if you're dressed as a waiter and people know you're a waiter, they interact with you as a waiter. Or police is another one. People they have police hats, and you're talking to police, so it defines the role. So the same in projects. If you know what people's roles are, it gives you a domain that you know they're going to be talking about. And particularly if people are far away from where you are, if you know what their role is, it's easier to have useful discussion with them. And we've already said communication is one of the big things. Now, the next thing that we can ask ourselves quickly is, are the processes under control? So what I mean by this is that in most businesses, they make money by doing the same thing every day. They fine-tuned it over a long period of time, and they know what to do, and they do it every day, and it churns stuff out, and they get paid for it. And so they have standard ways of doing things, and these are called processes. We do them the same way every time. And usually a project will actually be delivering something once off in principle, but it will do that by using as many processes as possible. So a company may, for example, be making cars, and they say, oh, we want a new model of car, but actually we could use the engine from an earlier version. And then everything that goes with the engine, the resourcing and the training of people, how to put it together, and the materials and everything is all the same. They just do the same again. So having processes is good. But what might happen is that the processes might have been written quite a long time ago and they may have gone out of date. So the question we ask ourselves is, are the processes there? Are they good for what we're doing now? Or has something moved? Maybe we need to compensate some way. And the fourth item on this very easy check is interpersonal. Are there any interpersonal or cultural clashes in the project? I worked in a company one time and they decided to look at Europe and then put countries together, working together. And of course, over the years, there have always been wars and all the rest of it. And there are some countries where the people, they don't really like the people in the next country. And it's very common. And if you put teams like that together, it can be very hard to actually make the project work. And it can be that people, they may have different styles, different culture, things like that. So those are the questions. Are the goals clear? Are the roles clear? So that when we talk to somebody, we know broadly what their zone of responsibility is. Are the processes that we're going to pull from to deliver our project, are they okay? Are they well defined? Are they up to date? Or is there something that we need to adjust around that? And the fourth question is interpersonal. Is there anything that may not work too easily from a cultural viewpoint? Maybe between, as I say, different countries or possibly between different individuals as well. Now, this is a very old model, as you can see from that, goes back to 1972, but it's still relevant today. So projects, as I say, usually use processes. So I give an example in a hospital. You come into a hospital and you've broken your leg. You were out skiing, for example, and they have a process. So what do? They examine you, they have a look at you, and then they say, aha, it looks like there's a broken bone. So they send you for an X-ray. And then when they've done that, they bring you back and they look at it and they say, we need to put plaster or whatever the equivalent is these days on your leg, for example. And then they will monitor it maybe over a period of weeks. They say, we'd like to see you every week just to know that it's getting on okay. And then when they say, we think it's okay now, they remove the plaster. So that's a process. And everyone who has a broken leg goes through something like that. And because they do it the same every time, the processes are really well tuned and optimized, usually. That's the way that it works. And projects use things like that to deliver the one-off result. So, for example, if you break your leg, your project is to get your leg fixed. It's once off. You're not going to break your leg every week, I hope. So, from your perspective, it's a project. It's going to happen once. But from the perspective of the hospital, they're just using processes to deliver the service. So we could think of lots of examples where this happens. In my line of business, I'm involved in consulting with companies, and they'll say, come in and we'll do a plan of what we're going to do. And very often somewhere there's a face-to-face contact. And I may have to get a train or a flight to go there. Now, when I go to the client, I don't demand my own timetable. I just look at the existing timetable, which is a process. They're doing the same thing every day. Here's an example of a project process. We could, at the end of a phase or at the end of an iteration, if it's an agile or whenever we want, at the end of the project, we can say what went well and what didn't go so well. And the things that went well, we say, let's do that again the next time. And what didn't go so well, let's avoid it the next time. So it's a very simple process. You slip it in, as it were, at appropriate points in your project, and you capture those things. If you didn't ask the questions, they would go missing. So let's move on to roles. I mentioned here a role is what a person does. It gives a sort of domain of responsibility. So if you go into the post office and somebody is behind the counter, their role is more or less defined by the environment. You expect them to talk about package weight and delivery dates and cost of stamps and things like that. So the role makes it easier to talk to them. But if you met the same person on the street, you wouldn't have this sort of environment that would point you in the right direction. For example, if you're talking to a project manager and that person is far away, at least you know what their style of business is and so on. And you get better communication. So here's some prominent roles that you find in projects. So a sponsor, usually these are not frozen in as it were, nobody owns the dictionary, but this is the way these words are usually used. So project sponsor is the person who provides or manages the resources. You cannot do a project unless you've got resources. And so the person who's looking after that is called the sponsor. And they tend to be senior managers, and they tend to have the project manager, if you like, reporting to them. But their interest is making sure that the project happens. Now, the next one is the product owner. And the product owner is a terminology from the agile world, which really means the representative of the client. So somebody who comes in and says, yeah, I like what you've done. No, I don't like it. Please change it, and so on. And because agile works in cycles or iterations, then the product owner actually decides, okay, in the next iteration, I want you to focus on this and this. So the product owner actually controls, if you like, the direction of the project. And then everyone else is assumed to be professional and working at their full capacity and so on. You may have a project manager, and particularly in predictive projects, you would do this. Somebody who is responsible to the sponsor, and it's their job to make sure the project actually happens. You might have a scrum master. So in the agile world, we talk about people being at the same level, that the people who are doing the work, they're just as professional as the people who are asking for it and so on. So there tends to be a discussion at one level, as it were. But to make sure that discussion takes place, it takes a bit of handling, if that's the right word. So make sure people are in the right place and that they come to the right meeting and so on. And the person that makes these processes work is called maybe a facilitator or a scrum master or a mentor, or there might be different names, but what it means is that they're the person that makes sure that people do the work, that the structure of the way that they work is correct so they can do the work. And the project team member, so this normally means the person who's going to do the work. And in the predictive project environment, this is probably taken from the project manager who says, please do this. In the agile world, the team member themselves decides what work they're going to be doing. The team as a whole will say, yes, we accept the challenge that for this iteration, we're going to work on this and this user story. And then how the work is shared out is very much self-directed. Here we go. Project sponsor's role is maybe one way of looking at it is the person who, if you like, is the publicity for the project outside the project. So somebody at a senior level who can talk on your behalf and talks to the project manager. And this relationship between the project manager and the sponsor is probably one of the most important human relationships in a project. The product owner's role I mentioned there is to know where the thing is going and actually to make decisions about which work to prioritize. In other words, which work to do. And it's a two-edged sword in a way, because if the project doesn't deliver, then people say you were the product owner and you made the decisions. But it's very effective because it means that the business interest is feeding directly into what work is done. In predictive projects, you'll have a project manager role. So this is more traditional, if you like, somebody who's in charge and tells people what to do, or at least agrees with what they suggest they do themselves. But it's their job to make sure that the project is implemented, whereas the sponsor is more for the, could I say, the interface to the outside world, outside the project. And the project manager must have an idea of what they're aiming for at the end of the project, what sort of a vision, and then communicate that vision to other people who are working. And then another task of the project manager is to make sure that the right people are put on the job and that they have the right competence and the right knowledge and the right skills and the right availability and so on. So some of that is going to be very formal. Somebody has to have such and such a certificate to do a particular job and so on. But some of it is much more observational. For example, one of your team might look very tired and you say, hey, what's going on here? And he says, oh, yeah, I was up all night with the child, so on. So those sort of things, they're not written into processes probably, but it's part of the job of the project manager to make it possible for people to do the work. In an agile world, you have a scrum master. So scrum master is different because the Scrum Master is not the boss, but more the person that makes sure that people do the use the right process. So if, for example, they say we're going to have 3-week iterations and we're going to have a daily stand-up, then the Scrum Master is the person that sort of cajoles people, as it were, into doing it that way. And of course, the more people are familiar with that particular style, then the less this person needs to intervene. And then they can act as a coach or a mentor. So probably somebody with quite a bit of experience, and they do that, but they don't take responsibility because the team is self-directing. They don't take the responsibility for the decisions there. So that's just a summary slide for anyone who's printing out this material. But in predictive projects, the project manager is the person who is told, you make the project happen. In agile projects, you have on the one hand the self-directive team, in other words, the people that do the work, and then you have on the other hand, you have the product owner who actually makes the decisions about we'll focus this way or that way. Okay, what about leadership and management? So this is a different topic now. We're talking that a project manager needs to be able to lead people so that they want to do the work, and then needs to make sure that the management is correct, that the right things turn up at the right place and people are properly informed and they follow the processes and all those sort of things. And we talk these days a lot about project managers, but I think if we were going back 50 years and with the insight we have today, we would probably call that project leadership. And the leader is to make sure that the environment is right and that people understand and that they want to be engaged and all of that. And of course, it's a whole science and art in its own right. So leaders have a vision and they have followers. Somebody somewhere needs to stand up and say, this is what we're doing. And of course, a vision means I can see what we're aiming to do, but it's not there yet. And it can be very hard to share that with other people, and that haven't seen it. So that's the big, maybe one of the big challenges is sharing the vision. And for that reason, people talk about getting quick payback and low-hanging fruit. You hear that expression as well. So leadership is a people skill. We've already said that. And of course, if the leadership is poor, then the motivation of the team is not going to be very good. And then that's going to spin off on the way that the project works. Of course, a project needs people, but not only does it need the people with the right skills, they must have the right experience, they must be available at the right time, they must know about the work, they must be motivated, and so on. And so it could turn out that somebody that technically is really good, for some reason, is not appropriate. For example, maybe somebody's spouse is in hospital or something like that, and that person is just too busy with life, as it were, to take on a big responsibility. But it's part of the management of projects is to make sure you have the right people there. Then we want people to do things. And probably one of the best ways of doing this is to trust people. Tell them what you want and share the ideas, and then ask them if they understand what they want. And then you say, okay, please do that. And people respond to that in a big way. To do that, you have to trust people. But by doing that, if you're responsible for a project, for example, then you're sending people away and you're thinking, gee, I wonder are they going to do it? It's a skill to get the ball rolling in such a way that the people, they do have enough skill and they do go away motivated. And then when they go away, you can rely on them and so on. And one of the key ways of generating trust is to listen. When I say listen, actively listen. Listen, what are people saying? So when you're talking to them and so on, you're not doodling or looking over your shoulder or something like that. You're actually focusing and trying to understand what they're saying, and then usually reflecting it back. So if you say, yeah, I think what you said was such and such, and then they know that you heard them. That's a very important tool for generating trust. So, just a summary statement here. A clear communication of the vision will contribute to the project success. And the vision must be the same, obviously, for the supplier and the client. And part of the challenge is getting that message across. And then good management will contribute to project success by making sure we have clear assignments, good tools, and so on. How the work is assigned depends on whether it's agile or predictive. The predictive, we talk about work breakdown structures and assignments and schedules and bar charts and all those things that we're probably mostly familiar with. And in agile, what we do is we plan a sprint or an iteration, there's different names for it, at a time. And an iteration might be 2 or 3 weeks' work, for example. And the work which is prioritized comes from a backlog. And the backlog is a list of things that need to be implemented at some stage. So some things they stay on the backlog forever, by the way. And the thing that has to be done is described by a user story, which is a little bit more broader than the task assignment. A task assignment says, please do this. But the user story says, this person wants this result, and because of that, please do this. And because you've got more of this background of who needs it and why, then it's easier to fine tune and to be efficient, if you like, in your selection of who does what. So a work breakdown structure, that's one way of showing it, as you see there. And the bottom level, the tasks, these are things that maybe an individual would do. But the work package is the level of assignment probably to a department. In agile work, people select their own. There's nothing to stop that happening as well in predictive. Traditionally, people say, you do this, you do that, and you say yes. But in the agile world, it's very conscious that you say, between us, we're trying to do this, who's going to do what, as it were. And people select their own work. And that's really good for motivation and also efficiency for all sorts of reasons. So what about remote working? What are the challenges that go with this? And I would put it like this, just to summarize it. I would say that if people are working in an office, they're surrounded by various services. Somebody looks after the heating, somebody else looks after the coffee, somebody else looks after the desk, somebody else looks after the IT, and so on. But when you're working remotely, you basically have to take over all those things yourselves. And you also have to negotiate what work you need to do with who's at the other end of the communication. And so you're acting much more like a sort of mini CEO. And it's really up to each individual, I think, to work out what are they supposed to be doing and to agree it with all the key people. So when they do it, it's no surprise. So obviously, physical presence is minimal or it's absent when people are working in different places, but there are all sorts of ways of keeping in touch. We all know this little red light or a green light that tells you somebody's logged in. And then, of course, webcams and teleconferences. Yeah, they're okay too. Telephone is much more accepted, I find, than teleconferences, but it's been there longer and people are just used to it, I think. But these days, compared to 10 years ago, teleconferences are far more widely used, as we all know. So when you're working on your own, it's quite stressful as well. So here's a few things that you can do. One of them is that you can work near other people. You can go into some sort of, they have hubs, internet hubs, and you can go in and you can get coffee and you have a desk and you're surrounded by people who are all doing their own work, but you're not on your own. So that type of environment can be very helpful. You can have routines, you can create routines. Some people will dress for work, or I've heard of people who work at home and they stand up in the morning and they walk around the house or around the block, and that's it, as if they were walking to work. And then when they get to work, they change mode and they go into a working style. Or you can have regular lunch. You can meet people for lunch, for example. And then everyone needs some interaction with others. That's the way people are. But if you don't get enough of that through your job because it's remote, there are other things you can do. Teaching an evening class, for example, in whatever your expertise is, one way of doing that. And all sorts of clubs, sports, music, and so on. So here's some suggestions for remote working. One of them is that if you're trying to work with people who are in a different place, minimize the need for face-to-face time. Yeah? Because of time zones. And there may be things that used to be done face to face. You talk to somebody and they agree and so on. That actually be much better done by some sort of process or system or shared database or something like that. So there's been a tendency to move that way. But having said that, there are lots of apps. I've got some of them mentioned there where people on both ends of a communication can log in at once. For example, Miro, by the way, I don't get any payback for any of these ones here, but Miro, for example, every person that logs in has a little arrow on the screen and their name is on it. So it's almost like crowding around a board and people can write on it at the same time and do drawings and things like that. So it's really very good for creative work. And it's probably just as good as doing it face to face. We need to respect everybody's availability. I've seen situations, for example, where people are working in India, shall we say engineers, and their boss is in, shall we say, in Europe, which is 3, 4, 5 hours west. And the boss in Europe says, "Oh, just before you go home, could you do this?" And of course, it's hours after closing time in India. And then the same thing happens between Europe and North America, of course. We need to respect people's time. It doesn't mean that they can't work outside these times. I have a colleague in California, and when I talk to him, we tend to do it before his breakfast because then it minimizes the time gap between us. So it's not impossible, but you don't want to get people out of bed. If you do, it's not very good for the motivation. And then, of course, if you're going to have meetings, make sure you get the most out of it. This is obvious, it's very standard stuff, but decide what you're going to talk about, stick to the agenda, keep good notes, and so on. And of course, these days you have tools that will listen in and they will record it and they'll apply artificial intelligence and give you a summary of what the action points are and all sorts of things. If all that happens automatically, that's fantastic. But the basic idea is come into a meeting prepared. So how you're going to orchestrate the action, it probably makes sense to write some of this down and say, we're going to do it this way. So if we're going to have meetings on a daily stand up at 8:15 or something, then it makes sense to write that down so that people know that's what's expected. And it can go into a project handbook. And a really good source of templates for this is the process PM squared, which is intentionally, if you like, a fusion of some of the bigger better known project methodologies, but in a much shorter form so that you don't have to be a project expert to use them. And also in their templates, they have instructions, which are really good. So you can say, no, I want a project handbook. And then you get the template, and the template has instructions about what should be in it and so on. And then it has a format. So I'd strongly recommend that. And it's free, by the way. So that's the cover of the project handbook from PM Squared. So here's some key learnings. Leadership is concerned with people on the left-hand side, and management is concerned with things. And we really have to get both of those right to get things to move. Clearly, people are people, and they all have different environments and moods and culture and availability and so on. It's a very active business being a project leader. Project management, make sure that the people who are doing the work have the right tools, the materials come, that the documentation is well thought out, that the processes work, all that sort of stuff is management. But it's our job, probably, if we're project managers, to make sure that those things are correct. And if they're not, maybe we need to compensate somewhere. So that's it. So thanks very much for your involvement there. As I say, we do these webinars on these key topics in a cycle, and they all go up on YouTube. You can come in at any stage in the cycle and then stay until it comes back to where you were. So look forward to meeting you again, and thanks very much for the interest. Thank you.